This video will be about making equivalent fractions and what they actually are. Now, an equivalent fraction is just a fraction or fractions that share the same amount of space, meaning they're the same length. They just have different names. I say it's like having a nickname. Instead of being called um, Nicholas, we can be calling you Nico or Nick. It's the same amounts, just a different way of saying it. So, for example, if we look at 2/2, that's the same as saying 10 tenths or even 100ths. It's all equivalent to 1/2. They're all representing the same amount. It's just a different way of writing it. Another one that's common is 1/2, which is equivalent to 3/6, which is equivalent to 4/8. And if you notice, the numerator in 1/2 is half of the denominator all the way through. 1 is half of 2, 3 is half of 6, 4 is half of 8, and I can even say 12/24 because 12 is half of 24, or I can even go 50/100ths because 50 is half of 100. It can go on and on and on and on. They're all equivalent to each other. But sometimes it's not that simple. Sometimes we'll be given fractions that look like this. And we'll have to figure out what goes in that box. Well, what you need to do is ask yourself, well, I have both of my numerators and I'm missing one of my denominators, but I know that these two fractions are going to be equivalent because of the equal sign there. So how did they get from 1 to 3? Well, I know that the number is getting bigger. It's going from 1 to 3. So it's either going to be adding or multiplying. And in this case, we're multiplying. Now, how in the world did I get from 1 to 3 using multiplication? Well, I can do 1 times 3. That gives me 3. Now, whatever I do to the numerator, I have to do to the denominator. So 2 times 3 gives me 6. So in the box would go 6. Now, if you don't believe me, I'm going to draw this out. In this top box, I'm going to draw 1/2, and I'm going to shade in 1/2. In this bottom box, I am going to put 3/6. And I'm going to shade in 3 of those 6's. If I notice here, the bars here line up for 1/2 and 1/3. They share the same, or 1/2 and 3/6. They share the same amount of space. The bars are the same length, but they're just different ways of saying it. Let's look at a couple more. Let's look at something like this. Let's look at something like this. 1/3 is equivalent to something over 6. Well, in this case, I know both of my denominators, but I don't know both of my numerators. So I'm going to ask myself, how did they get from 3 to 6? Well, it's getting bigger, so I'm going to multiply. But what in the world am I going to multiply? Well, I know that 3 times 2 gives me 6. So I'm going to multiply my numerator, by 2 as well. 1 times 2 is 2. So 1/3 is equivalent to 2/6. And if I come over here and again draw this out, this top bar belonging to 1/3 and this bottom bar belonging to 2/6. I'm going to draw my 6's here. Okay, 2/6. I will see that they line up and they're the same length. So 1/3 is equivalent to 2/6. Let's look at another one here. Let's look at something like this. In this case, I know, again, both of my denominators, but I don't know both of my numerators. But this time, I'm looking at my denominators. Instead of them getting bigger, it's actually getting smaller. It's going from 12 to 6. Well, if it's getting smaller, it's either dividing or subtracting, but in this case, it's going to be dividing. Now, the question is, 12 divided by what gives me 6? Well, 12 divided by 2 does. So that means I need to divide my numerator and my denominator by 2. 4 divided by 2 is 2. So 4/12 is equivalent to, or is the same as, 2/6. And again, I'm going to draw this out. My top bar here is going to belong to 2/6. My bottom bar here is going to belong to 4/12. And I'm going to draw all this sucker out. And I'm just going to pull these 6's down because 6 is half of 12 and I can use it to help me draw my 12's. And I'm going to color in 4/12. Again, as you notice, they match up, so they are equivalent to each other. I'm going to do one more. Let's look at something like this. Oops, I just gave my answer away. Hold on. But that's okay. We'll make it work. Now, when I'm looking at this one, I see that I have both of my numerators, but only one of my denominators. So I'm going to use my numerators to help me. I'm going to ask myself, how did I get from 2 to 1? I'm getting smaller, so I'm dividing. Well, what divided by 2 will give me 1? Well, 2. 2 divided by 2 will give me 1. So if I divided by 2 at the top, I'm going to have to divide by 2 at the bottom. 6 divided by 2 is 3. So 2/6 is equivalent to 1/3. Now I'm going to do one more and I'm going to show you something here. Let's look at this one. 4/12 is equal to 1 something. Well, let's see. How did I get from 4 to 1? Well, I had to have divided by 4. 4 divided by 4 is 1. So 12 divided by 4 is 3. So when we look at these, we can say that 1/3 is equivalent to 2/6, and it's equivalent to 4/12. And that is how you do equivalent fractions.